This was never supposed to happen. For over 20 years, the console war has been defined by one simple rule. You play Halo on Xbox, you play God of War on PlayStation, and the two shall never meet. They were digital nations with closed borders. But in 2024, the walls came down. Xbox is now publishing games on the PlayStation 5. This is the gaming equivalent of Coca-Cola agreeing to sell its formula in Pepsi cans. It's a white flag. It's an end of an era. And it's the single clearest sign that in the battle for the living room, Sony won. But how? How did a company that was a newcomer in the 90s, a company that got humiliated in the 2000s, and a company that was on the brink of irrelevance end up so dominant that its biggest rival is now developing games for it? This isn't just a story about hardware, it's a story of revenge, hubris, and a legendary comeback with one simple, brutal strategy that Sony mastered while everyone else got distracted. To understand how Sony won, you have to understand why they started fighting in the first place. And it all starts with the betrayal. In the early 90s, Sony wasn't a console giant. They were the Walkman guys. They wanted in on the video game boom. So they partnered with the king, Nintendo. They joined Project, a CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo. They called it the PlayStation. But at the 11th hour, Nintendo got cold feet. They were worried Sony would control the CD format. So in one of the most brutal moments in business history, Nintendo publicly and humiliatingly dumped Sony at the Consumer Electronics Show and announced they were partnering with Philips instead. Sony was furious. That humiliation lit a fire. A young engineer named Ken Kutaragi, now known as the father of PlayStation, convinced Sony's executives not to scrap the project but to double down, to build their own console, to compete directly with the company that betrayed them. The PlayStation launched in 1994 and it changed everything. While Nintendo stuck to cartridges for the N64, Sony embraced CDs. They were cheaper to make, held way more data, and allowed for full motion video and CD quality audio. But Sony's real genius was marketing. They didn't sell the PlayStation as a toy. They sold it as a cool adult piece of tech. They put demo units in nightclubs. The ads were edgy, weird, and aimed at teenagers and college students. And then they landed the ultimate killer app. They poached Nintendo's biggest partner, Square, and the flagship series. Final Fantasy VII was a game so massive, so cinematic, it would have been impossible on an N64 cartridge. The PS1 sold 102 million units. The N64, 33 million. Round 1 was a knockout. Sony wasn't just in the game, they were the game. If the PS1 was a knockout, the PlayStation 2 was a total annihilation of the entire industry. It is, to this day, the single best-selling home console of all time, 160 million units. And it won because of a masterstroke, a Trojan horse. The PS2 launched in the 2000s, and it wasn't just a gaming console. It was one of the cheapest and most widely available DVD players on the market. In an era before streaming, this was a system seller. Parents bought it for the living room to watch movies. Kids got a next-gen console as a bonus. It was brilliant. Microsoft jumped into the ring with the original Xbox and Halo, and Nintendo had GameCube, but they just couldn't compete with the PS2's library. GTA 3, Vice City, San Andreas, they were all timed exclusives that defined a generation. MGS2, God of War, Final Fantasy X. The PS2 had an avalanche of titles for every possible gamer. I made a whole video on the PlayStation 2, go watch it after this video. Sony wasn't just winning the war, they were the undisputed empire. And like all great empires, they were about to be undone by their own hubris.
In North America, the PlayStation 3 will be available at retail on November 17th, 2006. The 20 gigabyte PlayStation 3 will retail for $499 US dollars and 549 Canadian dollars. And the 60 gigabyte PlayStation 3 for $599 US dollars, $659 Canadian.
This is where it all went wrong. This is the moment Sony's ego wrote a check their fans couldn't cash. The PlayStation 3. It was arrogant, it was weird, and it was $599 US dollars. Sony had gotten high on their own supply. They built the PS3 around a bizarre complex processor called the Cell, which was powerful on paper but a nightmare for developers to actually use. They also insisted on including a brand new expensive Blu-ray player, a format that almost no one owned yet. Meanwhile, Microsoft did the exact opposite. They learned from Sony's PS1 strategy. The Xbox 360 launched a full year earlier than the PS3. It was cheaper, it was incredibly easy to develop for, and it had one thing Sony completely fumbled: online multiplayer. Xbox Live was a polished, simple, it just works system. Halo 3, Gears of War became global phenomenon. Call of Duty became synonymous with the 360 thanks to Microsoft's marketing deals. Sony was getting lapped. The PS3, despite having amazing late life exclusives like Uncharted 2 and The Last of Us, spent years trying to catch up. They were losing money on every console sold. They were losing the cool factor. The war was no longer a Sony landslide. It was a brutal, bloody street fight. And for most of that generation, Microsoft was winning. Sony was humbled, beaten. They knew they couldn't make the same mistake twice. So for the PlayStation 4, they went back to basics. They did something radical. They listened. They listened to developers building the PS4 with the simple PC-like architecture. And they listened to the fans, focusing on games, and more games. And then their old rival, Microsoft, handed them the victory on a silver platter.
Ladies and gentlemen, introducing Xbox One.
TV experience. TV. TV and movies. TV. Xbox. Watch TV. 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 TV.
Microsoft, in a stunning reversal, had become the arrogant empire. The Xbox One reveal in 2013 was a disaster. A mandatory, always-on camera in your living room. Confusion about blocking used games. A focus on TV instead of, games. Sony didn't just walk through the door Microsoft opened, they kicked it off its hinges. They came on stage and point by point dismantled everything Microsoft had just announced. More powerful? Check. Cheaper? $100 cheaper? Check. Online policies? No crazy restrictions? Check. And then they delivered the most savage legendary troll in corporate history.
This is how you share your games on PS4. Thanks.
PlayStation.
That was it. The console war was over before the consoles even launched. But Sony didn't just stop there. They knew a good launch wasn't enough. They needed to keep winning. And they did, with a relentless, unstoppable barrage of generation-defining, single-player, narrative-driven exclusives. While Microsoft was pivoting, focusing on a service called Game Pass, Sony was focused more on a product. They were building events, games that you had to buy a PlayStation to play. Games that dominated the Game of the Year conversations every single year. The PS4 outsold the Xbox One by more than 2-1. It was a comeback of historic proportions. Which brings us to today, the PlayStation 5. Sony is simply continuing the PlayStation 4's strategy. Build a powerful, desirable console, sell it to massive engaged audience, fuel it with must-play exclusives like Spider-Man 2 and God of War Ragnarok, partner with third parties for hits like Helldivers 2 and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Microsoft, realizing they couldn't beat Sony at their own game, tried to change the game. they went on a shopping spree, buying Bethesda and Activision. Their strategy was no longer about selling consoles, it was about selling subscriptions, Game Pass. But here's the problem. To make Game Pass profitable, you need a massive number of subscribers. And where are all the players? They're on the PlayStation. The PS5 install base is so enormous, so dominant, that Microsoft, the new owner of Call of Duty and Diablo, literally cannot afford to ignore those 60 plus million players. And that is why Halo is on the PlayStation. It's not an olive branch, it's a business decision. It's an admission that physical console war, the 20-year battle for the box under your TV, is over. Sony won. They won by starting a war out of revenge. They won by building the ultimate Trojan horse with the PS2. They learned from their $599 failure, and they won by executing a comeback with the PS4 built on one simple promise: play amazing games. Microsoft is now playing a different, longer term war, the war for the cloud, for subscribers, for a Netflix of gaming, and that might be the future. But in the war that defined the last 3 decades, the crown belongs to the PlayStation. Thanks for watching. What do you think? Is the console war truly over? Or is Microsoft just starting a new one? Let me know in the comments.